Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on the recording. This is going to be a fairly informal but hopefully meaningful conversation about the way that modern integrative medicine is being practiced in China, based on what I learned during my trip to Shanghai and my studies at Longhua Hospital there. And I have to start this session with a big tremendous thank you to all of you who supported me in taking this trip and really in all the work that I do because nobody can do their work in the world or offer what it is that they're here to give without people who are interested and engaged and participating and wanting to receive. So um, just your presence here and your presence through our connection on Facebook and through email list and all of those things, I am so deeply appreciative of all of that. Um, and then, of course, an extra special thank you, and really this kind of gift of this webinar is in honor of those of you who a number of months ago kind of stepped up and stepped forward to work with me when I did sort of my like I don't know flash sale of the seasonal compass program and looked for a certain number of people to join me in that program, and then we would mutually support each other through this trip. So extra shout out to those of you who are seasonal compass participants, and we've been able to work together one-on-one, and also you really were supporting this trip. So thank you for that. And I want to start by just talking a little bit about some of the things that were sort of like my anxieties on the way over to China and how it turned out when I got there. So the first thing is, I don't know, can you guys kind of tell me how you feel about how fragile is your routine when it comes to health and self-care, and how do you feel about travel? Is it something that's like really exciting, but then you're worried about being able to like eat the food you need to eat, or you get really stressed out and you can't stand all of the security and the uncertainties and all of this. So tell me kind of like where you are with travel, or is it like you wish that you could travel more, but the demands of work and family have made it hard to do so? Exciting, I just go with the flow. Okay, I kind of knew that about you, Em. um, um, and I'd love to hear, we all have different strengths in this area, so maybe those of you who are really successful travelers, I'd love to hear like some of your favorite tips. I'm going to give you my favorite weird airplane tip in a second. Um, so I was traveling, going on this trip. This was a pretty big financial commitment for me, and I have a friend whose mother used to work for Delta Airlines, and she offered me one of the buddy passes that they have in a year to give to people, which gives you access to very affordable airfare, but you have to fly standby. So it was never certain to me like what flight I was going to get on, whether I was going to make my connections, whether there was going to be a seat open. So there was a lot more uncertainty for me kind of this particular time flying than usual. Um, and yeah, there's stress if it's a first time experience for Paula. Wendy loves it, but she gets stressed, especially if things don't go as planned or expected. Yeah, I think we can all relate to that. Um, and this was like major practice for me on the art of being open and surrendering and being willing to go with the flow, because I really had no choice because I didn't ever know um, what planes I was going to get on or if I was going to get stuck somewhere. So I did a couple of things that some are sort of travel rituals that I always do, and some are a little bit unique to this trip that I wanted to share. And the first is my favorite airplane tip of all times. And you know, one of the hardest things about air travel is that, especially if you're on a really long flight, the air in the plane is so dry, and I mean, no matter how much water you drink, you're just going to get pretty dehydrated, and it's really difficult to stay just stay hydrated, and your skin feels the effects, your whole body can feel the effects. And then a lot of our digestive systems, like, constipation is a major, major issue when people are traveling. And then the food that we tend to pack or eat when we're on an airplane doesn't really help, because a lot of times, even if we're going for healthy options, it's like, the nuts and the trail mix and the bars and all of the food is dehydrated too, which makes it a lot easier to pack and fit into your bag, but it's not exactly what your tummy wants at that moment. So my favorite tip of all time is the day before you go in the airplane, go to the store and get a nice big, like full on big size box, or whatever it's called, quart of strawberries, um, and save them until you get hungry on the plane. And so I did this time, as I always do, and it is like the most wonderful restorative when you're about midway through a flight and you're hungry and you're thirsty and you're dehydrated, to pull out those strawberries, and the smell and the freshness. Um, it is absolutely my favorite travel tip of all time. Um, and it also helps you not to overpack, because you've got to save room in at least your carry-on bag for those strawberries, and then once you eat them, they're gone. So it kind of helps you to immediately have a slightly lighter load when you get off the plane. So the other thing that I did, that part of this was also about thinking about what the conditions were going to be once I got to Shanghai. And the air pollution there is a real issue. It's not as bad as Beijing and some of the other cities in China, but it is far worse than what I'm used to here, and even in Washington, D.C., which is a major metropolitan area. So I also chose an adaptogenic set of remedies, an adaptogenic formula to take while I was on the plane that would help with kind of immunity, stress, um, the major stress of transitioning that many time zones, missing sleep, all of those things. And also that would be really supportive while I was dealing with the environmental allergens and pollution and all of that in Shanghai. And it was a mushroom-based formula. I think it has chaga, reishi, and maybe one other of the medicinal mushrooms in there. So I was taking that very regularly throughout the flight as well. And as soon as I arrived in Shanghai, um, I noticed the situation with the air, and I was working on adjusting. But really, everything was going very smoothly. And as a person who has some pretty specific dietary requirements as a vegan, the next big hurdle was to think about, like, okay, how am I going to manage the food situation? And I was traveling with a lot of people, or I wasn't traveling with them, but a lot of people in the group, other practitioners and students who I was with. There were a lot of us who had dietary specifications. And it's really interesting, because in China, this is just not part of what's going on. There's an understanding around being vegetarian, and that it's can be part of people who are strict Buddhists there will be vegetarian, or something very close to vegan. And there is understanding around that in the culture. And then there is a growing animal rights movement in China as well. Didn't really meet anyone or interact with that at all, but I know that that's something that's happening. And but aside from that, there's not really a conversation about food allergies. There's no real awareness about gluten intolerance, or any of these things. And so trying to navigate the restaurants was definitely an interesting experience and really a moment of seeing the differences in the culture. Um, and then what really fascinated me was that this wasn't just something that was happening kind of in the restaurants and among regular people. This also really came into play in the hospital when we started talking and working with the doctors there. So I think I mentioned um, even among the gastroenterologists and the endocrinologists, all of the doctors that we met, there was only one who had really any, I won't say familiarity, but there was only one who really agreed that issues around like gluten sensitivity were something to be concerned about or were a significant problem. And I found that so fascinating because right now I feel like in the integrative medicine world in the West, there is a huge focus on food allergies, intolerances, and um, restricting or avoiding certain things in our diets as a primary intervention for all kinds of different conditions. So tell me if this is, does that sound true to you? Like, is it just me, or does it feel like every time you turn around, someone is recommending that another thing be removed from our diets? Um, I really don't think that it's just me noticing this. Lindy says yes. And I'm not making a value judgment on this, right or wrong. I'm just wanting to highlight the differences. Okay, so I am not saying one way or the other is right or wrong. Um, Okay, Ellen says, I went to Italy last summer. Food allergies are almost non-existent. And a person I was traveling with who cannot eat gluten here had no problem in Italy. Fascinating. That is fascinating. Um, yeah, fascinating. Um, so in, so not only were people just sort of saying, oh, and the one doctor who did say, yes, sometimes wheat can be a problem, this doctor was a dermatologist. And I thought that was really interesting that of all of the specialties, the one person who was noticing that was the dermatologist. But then she also said, oh, well, we don't really eat very much wheat here in Shanghai, which is absolutely not true. There's wheat in almost everything because soy sauce is used in almost everything. And Shanghai has a very rich history of French culture and Russian culture influencing. So they have bakeries and sweets and like all kinds of bread, and it's actually, there's a ton of wheat in the cuisine there. So I don't know that doctors sort of saying, oh, well, it's not a problem, we don't eat it, but they do eat it. So it's very strange. Um, anyway, the gastroenterologist, when we spoke with her about celiac disease, she said, oh, yes, we call this something different here, and there's a specific kind of diarrhea that they have a name for it, that it maps on exactly to celiac disease. And they really talk about the most critical manifestations of celiac disease. People are really unable to assimilate nutrients and, significant weight loss and malnutrition, essentially. And she said that one of the main medicinals that they use for this condition is shenchu, which is a kind of fermented wheat. So in fact, and she really insisted because there was some disbelief in our group. We had a person who is gluten intolerant in the group, a very experienced practitioner, a teacher of mine, who was just shocked that this was the case. And the doctor really insisted, no, the nature of the wheat is transformed through the fermentation and it then becomes a medicine. So, there's a lot that we don't know about the immune system and about specifically some of these, non-IgE mediated food allergies. They show up in ways that we don't fully understand. And there are a lot of people who talk about fermentation as a way of sort of mitigating some of these effects. And this is a data point that I think is very interesting kind of in light of all of that information. And so one of the things that was a personal learning for me and kind of my own health is, like a lot of people, living in this culture that is so carb phobic, even though, and many of my clients, how I encourage you to eat healthy carbs and to not be afraid of them. I have to encourage myself in doing that too. And faced with a breakfast of congee, which is made of white rice and herbs that are cooked together in kind of a thick soup almost. So I'm thinking even more easily digestible carbs, right? Like even faster to enter the bloodstream. And then a bun next to it. So like this was the breakfast that I was having on most days. And I was absolutely terrified starting to eat this breakfast that, oh my gosh, like I'm going to eat this. And then in 2 hours, I'm going to be so hungry and, my blood sugar is going to crash and it's like too many carbs. I was having total carb phobia facing those breakfasts. And much to my shock, um, I had some of the best energy, focus, digestion, kind of light feeling, just consistent energy, made it all the way through to lunch without any, hunger or desire to snack that I've experienced in a really long time. So I learned about myself that, first of all, my insulin response is healthier than I give it credit for. And that some of this like carb phobia had kind of kept me even still restricted a little bit or a little bit afraid about certain foods or certain kinds of breakfasts. And in fact, it turned out to work really well for me. So get ready, if I haven't already been really encouraging you to not be super afraid of healthy carbs. Get ready for me to have like new fire in myself about feeling a little bit more confident that as long as you're metabolically healthy, that it's perfectly fine to have a pretty carby breakfast if you would like to. Celine is saying perhaps the chemicals used by farmers is a greater problem here, and other parts of the world use less toxic chemicals. It's a reasonable theory in a lot of ways. However, when it comes to China, the processes there for approval of, even medical treatments are often approved much faster there. And I have no doubt that it's not like we're talking about some sort of pristine, idyllic agricultural system when we're talking about China. Far from it. So I'm not all that inclined to think that, that there's a big difference in terms of the chemicals or something like that, and that's the reason that, it's not an issue over there. Maybe, but I suspect that there are other factors that have more to do. I think that probably food allergies and intolerances are fairly consistent across populations that are industrialized, but that here we are misdiagnosing or self-misdiagnosing a lot of things as being related to food allergies and intolerances when really they're not. And that in China, perhaps there are things that truly are related to food allergies and intolerances that are not being named in that way. That's my theory at this moment. And who knows, but that's my guess, is that it's a lens of looking at what's right and what's wrong. And there are some different ways. I think over there, one of the other cultural differences that I noticed, and I really wanted to show you guys a video of this. I'll have to post it on Facebook. Every morning before we started our workday, my friend and I would go to this big, beautiful park. I have never seen such beautifully landscaped parks as I've seen, as I saw in Shanghai. And I live in the capital, of this country, and very close to the National Arboretum. And I have to say, like, just a random park in Shanghai puts the U.S. National Arboretum to shame, in terms of the landscaping. It is absolutely incredible. Um, and so much of Chinese culture is about the idea of balance and harmony. And the landscaping is about creating the not a perfect reflection of what nature is like on its own, just kind of in the wild, but creating and actively cultivating a balance between humans and the natural environment. And again, not to romanticize or idealize anybody's culture, because within China itself, people will really talk about the fact that economically they can be very focused on what's beneficial now, and there are major environmental problems. The pollution in Shanghai being no small example of this. So it's not to say that this ideal is something that they perfectly live up to, just like almost none of us live up to our ideals perfectly. But it's beautifully reflected in the parks and the landscaping. And every morning we would go to this gorgeous park, and the park would be absolutely full of people who are there before their work day, or retirees who are there, people who are there with children, though mostly not, mostly adults. And there would be one group of women who were like line dancing, and they had like their like little CD player, and they're line dancing. And then the groups of people who are practicing Tai Chi, um, including people with swords, practicing like Tai Chi with their swords. So can you imagine, here in the US, if like you show up to the park with your sword for Tai Chi practice, that would not go very well. And people walking through the park with their arms stretched out, to the sides like this. This is opening the lung meridians. They're like walking, opening the lung meridian, or walking and like moving their fingers to get all of the meridians activated. And I and some people, I would occasionally see people jogging, but mostly what I saw were people who were focusing on moving their bodies through full range of motion, not overly strenuous exercise. So much more, just sort of gentle, constant aerobic exercise, stretching and flexibility, and kind of being present in this beautiful environment. So Vanessa says, thank you. I want to go to China now. Yes, you should totally go. You should definitely go if you're thinking about it. Um, so I just couldn't help but think, and then there are lots of people there. It's very social, and day after day as we went, I saw the same people there every day. So when I think about then like my exercise life here in DC, where first of all, I'm not just going to the park exercising for free. Though now in the wake of the trip, I probably will be doing that because I need to save a little bit of money. But spending $100 or so a month for these like expensive, fitness pass memberships or a gym membership, that's about what it costs here in DC. It's very expensive, and everybody's got to have their specific like super trendy gym outfit. And then when you go to the gym, you've got to like go super hard, and people are dripping with sweat, and it's like it's intensity. It's all about intensity. And in China, there is a real emphasis because of the traditional medicine perspective. There's a real emphasis on movement and on harmony and on breath and using the body. But there is an equally important principle of not exercising past the point where you feel kind of energized and alive. Like going to the point of exhaustion is seen as something that can be perilous or dangerous, that it depletes the body rather than energizing it. Now, we know from a scientific perspective that it's not at all the case that strenuous exercise is automatically bad for you. But when you think about the possibility for injury, when you think about the appropriateness of exercise across the lifespan, what people are doing culturally there for exercise is a much more appropriate sort of broad general prescription that's everybody. And indeed, that's who was in the park, adults of all ages, rather than this kind of go hard or go home attitude that we tend to have towards exercise here. Um, and I think of clients and people I know who can feel down on themselves because they'll say, like, well, all I do is going for a walk, or I'm not really working that hard, or I only sort of break a light sweat. When really, in a lot of traditional cultures, that was the ideal for many centuries. So I think that there, I was hearing mostly from the doctors when they were recommending, they all were recommending lifestyle as part of their prescriptions to the patients. Um, all but one of them, I guess it's like the sort of like 9 out of 10, like the 9 out of 10 dentists agree or whatever. There's always the one dissenter, but all but one of them were really emphasizing Tai Chi, walking, these gentle kinds of exercise. Um, the one doctor who I heard tell somebody, not just your Tai Chi, like you need to run or you need to like do something a little more than that, was the doctor who is focusing on respiratory health. So interesting to kind of notice that. Okay, I feel like I've lost a little bit where I am in the thread. So I would love to pause for a second and hear any feedback, thoughts, questions, anything that's coming up for you now. And then I'm going to see if I can give you a couple of these tidbits that I mentioned in the email. I'm also just kind of looking at your names and seeing who's here. A couple of you guys that I don't know. So welcome, and I'm glad to see you. Okay, so the next thing I want to mention, and this came from that doctor was who was telling people to, do something a little harder than the Tai Chi. He was a really, really interesting guy and a great teacher. And he said that, and so he's the respiratory guy, and he was mostly seeing people with lung cancer because in Shanghai, lung cancer is the most prevalent kind of cancer that people have. There is a lot of smoking, lots and lots of smoking inside, which I hadn't been in an inside environment where people smoked since I was a little kid before it was banned. And a lot of the herb shops actually sell cigarettes. So it's a big issue there. And then in addition, there's the environmental pollution, which they're not certain, but there's a lot of reason to believe that the environmental pollution also contributes to the high incidence of lung cancer. And breast cancer is much, much less prevalent there than it is here. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that in populations where people eat or where women eat soy before they start their menstrual cycles, before adolescence, that seems to have a pretty major impact in reducing the incidence of breast cancer. So that may be a factor in sort of why lung cancer is such a comparatively big killer there. So he sees a lot of lung cancer cases, some asthma, some, kind of obstructive pulmonary issues. We saw a case of interstitial pneumonia. So a lot of different things, but lung cancer is the big one. And so he was giving us this amazing like formula that he had given to one of his clients. I have weeks of work to do in analyzing all of the formulas that I received. Um, Mostly in the moment, all we could do was write it down as fast as we could, and we'll have some unpacking to do now that we're all home. But this formula easily had 30 herbs in it. And he said, you know, the best way to prevent herb-drug interactions, because this person was a lung cancer patient and had already had surgery, and was also taking other medications. And I can't remember exactly what the situation was, but it was a post-surgical person who had lung cancer. And he said the best way to prevent herb-drug interactions is to give lots and lots of herbs, but use relatively small amounts of each one. So I really want us to think about the way that that would sound to kind of the ears of a Western-trained physician or pharmacologist. And actually, we have a Western-trained MD on the line right now. So if I won't out you, but if you want to share your perspective, I would absolutely welcome it. Um, so um, it's absolutely ingrained in me from the Western side of my thinking that, oh my gosh, you know, the worst thing to do if you're afraid of an interaction is to put more substances in the mix, right? Like, um, don't throw more things in the pot if you're afraid that something in the pot's going to react. But instead of that perspective, which part of the reason that Western trained, you know, pharmacologists and physicians and pharmacists would all be concerned about herbs in the first place is because even a single herb has many, many, many compounds in it, not just one single compound the way that the vast majority of pharmaceutical drugs have. And the idea being that, you know, like there's one thing in this pill, we can know the exact amount of the dose, and then we can use, you know, we can control. It comes from that fundamental idea of a controlled experiment where we reduce the number of variables and then introduce one thing that we can change and that we can manipulate to see how that changes things. So instead of kind of being within that paradigm, which I admittedly do an awful lot, and think, well, let's only add one herb at a time or one formula at a time. Let's try to minimize the number of inputs so that we can see what's really working. And instead of doing that, his approach was much more based in the idea that the dose makes the poison. And not only that, but that the dose is what is the most relevant when it comes to creating some kind of an interaction. And all that I can say is every single one of these physicians, all of them had medical degrees. They all were MDs. And they were all working with patients who they were moving back and forth seamlessly between prescribing Western drugs and traditional Chinese medicine formulas. Sometimes both things within a single case. So if anybody knows anything about herb-drug interactions, it's these people who are doing this every single day and seeing just, you know, in an hour, seeing 20 patients, or, you know, well, in an hour and 15 minutes. We had one doctor who saw 20 people in that time doing this for all of them. So there's, you know, I tend to trust his opinion. And it was really, really a big surprise to me. Okay, I'm going to read these questions. Celine says, do you feel that the US will ever integrate alternative medicine as much as they do in China? I think there are a couple of barriers to that. First is we do not have an indigenous cultural tradition of alternative medicine that has grown up over the centuries alongside of the mainstream kind of political situation. Of course, there are multiple indigenous medicines that were here on this land, but those traditions have been largely wiped out along with the genocidal practices that have led to the obliteration of the indigenous people here in North America. Um, there are still people who are practicing and holding and carrying those traditions, but those people are so marginalized that it is really hard to imagine that in the way that it has happened in China, that that would ever become part of the mainstream here. It just would be very surprising. So I think that's one reason. And another reason is that there are huge political differences between here and China, of course. And one of the really interesting and also problematic things about Chinese medicine as it is currently practiced in China is that some of the resurgence of Chinese medicine happened because the Communist Party, after the Cultural Revolution and the period of time when kind of all sorts of, intellectual and artistic and cultural pursuits were destroyed, demonized, people were killed. I mean, pretty horrible, kind of terrifying stuff that happened during the revolution. After that period, there was a real problem because a lot of the physicians were killed or put in jail because they're sort of part of this, bourgeois class or whatever, and the intellectuals. So there was a real problem of like needing to have doctors for people. And one of the ways that the communist government saw fit to solve this problem was to elevate the idea of traditional Chinese medicine as something that was a source of national pride, something that belonged to the people. And they trained a lot of people in TCM very quickly and at kind of a lower level than the people that certainly I was with practicing, just as a way to kind of get folks out there and try to help with getting people medical care of some kind. And in doing that, the tradition itself um, was edited and changed. And there are big differences between what many people are now calling classical Chinese medicine, based on the real texts of the classics, and traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, which is sort of the practice that is currently upheld and supported by the government. So it's really fascinating that even, Chinese medicine itself is not monolithic, and there's always there's political stuff. Healing is political, just like we talk about the personal being political. Medical is political as well. So all of this is in the mix in China, just as it is here, just in different ways. Um, and so we don't have something here in this country that's like a source of cultural pride that would be worth elevating. And there is a single payer system in China for healthcare. Um, and so there is a real incentive to use these less expensive, less technologically complex forms of herbal medicine that jive with the culture and help to reduce costs for everybody, because this, instead of a system that's sort of a for-profit system with lots and lots of stakeholders, there are fewer stakeholders, and reducing costs across the board is good for everybody. Reducing costs is not good for everybody in our medical system. And I'm not saying that people are evil. I think, it's a complex problem, but things are just very different. So I think that there is enough energy here around complementary and alternative medicine for things to start transforming and to look pretty different than they look now. But I think it's going to evolve to look very different from how it looks in China. And I don't know, we'll see. It's an open question. Okay. Let's see, scroll back up a little bit. And then Vanessa also asks, are myth-based medicines going away anytime in China, like rhinoceros horn, tiger, bear bile, she mentions, things that they believe work, though they have no basis. I hope so. So this is the sad and complex truth. And I say this as an animal rights person and as someone who um, has loathes any form of animal exploitation and certainly, endangered species. Um, some of those remedies, as crazy as they sound, do actually work in some way. So, for example, in one of the presentations, we had a lecture, and the lecturer was he was a uh, the word is leaving me right now, but he's a heart doctor, cardiologist. And at some point, he mentioned ivory as a medicine, and the efficacy of it and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, like the whole room is like, like I can't believe he's talking about ivory and using ivory. And we were all just sort of like, we're being trying to be polite or like, well, we wouldn't have access to that, and he really was saying, well, they only use the extra ivory after they carve a Buddha, there's ivory left over. And then he did give us, alternatives and things that you can substitute. Some of those medicines do seem to have, there are ways that they work, or that they do seem to work. There is an absolutely amazing NGO called Animals Asia that has an entire traditional medicine campaign, and they have been working really hard to educate the healthcare providers and the pharmacies and patients about things that you can use to substitute for these medicines, and the reasons why those medicines, while they may be part of the classical tradition, are harmful and not really appropriate to use anymore. And I think there's been a lot of really good response. In all of the formulas that we received in the hospital, like as we're following people, I didn't hear of any of those substances being used, though chicken stomachs were used a number of times. That's, I think, the only animal-based medicine that I really was aware of. And chickens are being eaten for food there, so it's not like a separate sort of medical industry, as far as I know. But yes, there are a lot of people working on that issue, and I think it's not totally on the way out, or it's not totally out. But I think that for a lot of reasons, including economic reasons, people are looking for alternatives. Okay, Celine says it's common here for elderly patients to take many medications. What was the observations regarding the number of meds? Yeah, way fewer medicines than people here are taking, though if you look at just the number of medicinal substances, like if you think about one formula, and in that formula there are 30 or 40 herbs, um, depending on how you look at it, arguably people are taking more things there, but made into one formula, or many, many ingredients in one soup, rather than, I don't know, a 10-course meal or something. It's not the perfect analogy. Um, but yeah, by and large, um, it would seem like, the older folks that I saw, first of all, there's much less obesity there than here. And people remain very active in a way that, I just don't see here as much. And one piece of this is extremely practical. In China, most of the toilets are squat toilets. There's a hole in the ground. So at minimum, people are squatting all the way down and then standing back up a couple times a day in order to use the bathroom. And one of the main predictors of independence and kind of continued health and mobility for older adults is glute strength. So if you have to bend all the way down and get all the way back up, that's more than I think most elderly folks here in the US are doing. And it's going to maintain your glute strength. So there are some really simple little things that I think make a pretty big difference. Sharon says, I'm coming more and more to that low dose approach to everything, pharmaceuticals, foods, types of exercise. That's really awesome to hear. Yeah. Um, so I'm going to kind of out you now because I think you're doing it, Sharon. So Sharon is our MD in attendance, and she says, I don't like seeing 4 to 6 per hour. I love a much slower pace. That was the biggest difference to among kind of the group that I was with, where, as alternative providers here in the US, a lot of the value that we offer is being able to take a lot more time in our appointments. With most of my clients, I spend an hour. So it's a huge difference from what's going on over there. I mean, I saw the doctors, they're like taking pulses and talking on the phone at the same time. There's a lot on. And a part of this has to do with the nature of the demand at a hospital like that. And, there are just so many people. They were really treating a lot of people. Okay. So this is going to be sort of a weird, but I'm remembering some of the things that I promised I'd talk about, and I'd love to keep getting your questions if there are more things you're wondering. Um, so while I was there, the first few days, I'm like, oh, I'm eating all these carbs and I feel great and like everything's good. And then after about 5 days, I got a terrible, terrible eczema flare up on my hand. I don't know if you can see. It's far better now than it was, but all of my fingers, my palm, so itchy, just terrible. And I could not make a clear connection between any specific thing that I had eaten and my hand. It seemed like it almost seemed like my body just went like, wow, like no more. And I noticed a lot of other people kind of struggling. I was really puffy. I'm still maybe a little bit retaining some water, but like really, really puffy. My eyes are super puffy. Um, and I I thought that kind of because I found a chunk of plastic in my food one day, and every restaurant that we would go to, when I learned a little bit of Mandarin, as best I could to try to meet people where I could with the language. Um, but I certainly cannot speak the language anything close to even like a conversational level. Um, we noticed like we're getting the English language menus in a lot of different restaurants, all different kind of low end, high end, all everything in between, and they all were the same menu, and the menus were huge, like many, 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 many pages, and the food would be ready very, very quickly. So we came to the conclusion that maybe part of what was happening is like all of this food is somehow coming from a central place and is maybe frozen or pre-prepared or something, or there are preservatives, or MSG is certainly used very widely. And then maybe it's just being warmed up before being served, or it's not all being cooked fresh, or who knows. So I did kind of have the experience of going in thinking, oh, I'm going to be really like easy breezy about all of this. And then once I had my carb experience, I was like, oh, I'm doing great. And and then I did have that realization of like, oh, um, as much as I want to not be affected or not be sensitive in these certain ways, there are some kind of hard limits or like things that my body just can't do. And maybe it's a combination of, the air. I mean, even just one day, like trying to walk a little bit fast, and maybe this is partly why people don't run, trying to walk a little bit fast because I was running late to get to the hospital. I could feel that my lungs were burning. And of course, many people were wearing masks, respirators to walk down the street. So I think that there is, kind of thinking about all of this moderation and flexibility and acknowledging that maybe this food allergy thing is not as big a deal as we all make it out to be, my hand flared up to really remind me that none of this is black and white. And I'm not coming back from China ready to say, oh, don't worry about any of this stuff, let it all go. Um, but but I am really noticing that there are certain ways that I think we can relax when it comes to some of these fears. And I also think that, you know, when what I saw happening in a really excellent way there was integrative medicine, where in the consultation, at the moment of a person consulting a provider, all of the available medical tools from these two different systems are on the table and able to be used. Um, I saw a woman with very acute hyperthyroidism, to the point like her whole body's shaking, this, really suffering. And the first line treatment was an herbal formula. And I saw people who, had been struggling with infertility and had tried herbs, and then, the solution offered was in vitro fertilization. Um, I saw the whole spectrum being offered, to that person in the moment. But meanwhile, um, there was a way that being in the air that's, so polluted and you can't even walk fast or it's going to burn your lungs, and having a hard time, it was actually very difficult to even order, just like plain tea or steamed veggies. Um, there's a way that I feel like the bringing that perspective into the environment as a whole and really creating a healthy environment for everybody. The integrative medicine that looks beyond the individual to the community, to the environmental health of a place. I did not see that being held up as an example there in a way that I hope we can all start to work toward as humans and people who are interested in health and well-being. And I think, maybe the last thing that I really want to share and reflect on, and unless there are some other questions, is that there was one of the doctors that we worked with really said to us, she's like, oh, you are so lucky. You get to practice Chinese medicine without specializing. And one of my teachers who was there with us, she said right back to her, oh no, like you're lucky, like you get to specialize. And I think it gets a little bit to what Sharon was saying about having the slower pace, having here the kind of work that I am doing, having the opportunity to really spend a lot more time with somebody, to really look at all of the kind of environmental and the relational environments that someone is in, not only looking at what are you ingesting physically, but what are you ingesting emotionally and psychically, and what, are you fulfilled in your work and your relationships? All of those things are part of this tradition, but because of the demands that were on these physicians and on their time, they really didn't have the freedom and the space to practice in that way. And so while there are so many things that I admire about this system, I mean, the access that people have, I mean, the healthcare is very affordable, um, and the system is very efficient because of that single payer setup. And there are a lot of disadvantages to this political system in China, human rights being no small matter. And just in terms of efficiency, they have us totally beat. Um, and yet, there is something that's really lost in creating most efficient or striving to take Chinese medicine and place it in the context of a modern working hospital. And so I think, as we think and talk about things like cultural appropriation, which I think is so important to do, I think that we have to remember that these ancient cultural traditions, in some way, can be just as easily appropriated or distanced from the heart of what they are about by people who, are ethnic inheritors of the culture, as it can be done by outsiders. And there is a certain way that, especially kind of given the way that a lot of the emotional part of, focusing on how the emotions create disease and imbalance is really not as much part of modern traditional Chinese medicine as it is part of classical Chinese medicine. Because one of the things that happens if you live in a culture that purports to be a political utopia, that can really only, like, if someone's upset and unhappy, part of that ideology says, well, personal unhappiness is because of political inequity and because of a bad system. So you have to kind of, there's a disconnect. And you can't really work with the emotional side of the tradition in the same way. It's really been erased. And there may be a role that people who live and work outside of China can play in preserving and keeping alive the parts of the tradition that are not particularly in favor in mainland China right now because of the current political situation. And at the same time, the pressures of Western medicine have come to bear on the practice of modern Chinese medicine. And one of the younger physicians that we were with, and she was the only one who held this belief, but at a certain point she said, oh, well, you have to always be testing liver and kidney function every 6 months if people are taking herbs. And we pressed her a little bit and said, well, which herbs and, what's the evidence? And she really couldn't answer the question. She just said, it's evidence-based medicine, and we don't have the evidence that the herbs are safe, and so we have to make sure we test people. And it's not wrong. I really respect caution, but it's pretty shocking to hear someone say, we don't have the evidence, when she's working in a hospital where, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I mean, certainly thousands of people are being treated in that hospital every day. And most of them are taking herbs, and most of them are taking herbs for longer than 6 months. And if there were rampant problems of liver and kidney failure, it would be apparent. So, but this phrase evidence-based medicine has come to be narrowly defined as very specific kinds of evidence that are accepted, and other kinds of evidence that are perhaps equally clear are not under that umbrella. And that's the influence of Western medicine that is now absolutely in dialogue with the traditional practice. So, so I think it's a really fascinating thing to be alive at this moment in history, to have access to all of these different paradigms, to have access to all of these different ways of knowing. And I really do hope that we will be able to emulate and learn from the open-mindedness that these doctors had about just using what works, whether it's herbs or whether it's an antibiotic or whether it's VF or chemotherapy, using everything, because at the end of the day, the purpose of medicine is to give people the most of a chance that they have at living a worthwhile, meaningful life, learning the lessons that they're here to learn, being free from suffering, giving their gifts to the world. And really, our job in medicine is to get out of the way, not make it about us, and just give people what they need. So I'm really hoping that we'll be able to learn more from what's working over there and emulate that. Okay, so we're right about at 4 o'clock. I would love to know if there are any other questions or comments. I can stay on for about 15 more minutes. And I do want to just say a little word for any of you who might be thinking about bringing herbal medicine into your life, or possibly us working together. But I will wait to do that until I know that we've kind of gone through all of our questions and we're feeling complete. So any feedback, questions, thoughts at all, I would love to hear. I'd also love to know, this is a little unrelated. Um, I'm working on a class that I'm really excited about that I think, I don't know, it'll probably be a couple months before this happens, because there's something else that's coming first that's going to be about skin. Um, I'm wondering how many of you are, I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with acupuncture, have some idea about acupuncture. If that's not true, then definitely, like, raise your hands and let me know if that's a totally foreign idea. But I'm wondering how many of you have ever heard of or tried or used moxibustion. I'll type it in so that you can see. Vanessa says foreign idea. Does that mean acupuncture is a foreign idea or moxibustion is a foreign idea? Vanessa says both. Okay. Um, Emily says, so here we receive a lot of feedback about diet. Did I miss the first part of that comment? Um, oh, I'm interested about how they view autoimmune issues. Um, yeah, I really wish that we had gotten more on that. I lobbied really hard for it. We had time in the hospital where we were following doctors through the wards and like essentially going on rounds or sitting with them as they received inpatient consults. And then we had lectures in the afternoon that went kind of deeper into theory and practice. It's kind of a combination style. I really lobbied hard for a lecture on autoimmunity, and I didn't get it. The thing that I saw the most was, when it comes to autoimmune illness, um, were thyroid cases. Lots and lots and lots of thyroid cases, both during the rounds in gynecology and also in the rounds in endocrinology. And uh, there was not, because we're moving so fast, there wasn't a lot of time, to talk about theory. So I didn't really get anything new there that wasn't already part of my understanding of the TCM theory. Diet was absolutely not a big part of what they were talking about. The dietary counseling I can really only describe as strange, just culturally very, very strange to me and hard to understand. Um, the main things, there are sort of a group of foods that I don't remember the tone. It's a tonal language, so you have to know what tone something is in order to pronounce it right. The word is fa, but I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly because I don't know the tones. Um, but these certain kinds of foods that, the fa foods are seen as enhancing illness, whatever the illness might be. And people with autoimmune problems, cancer, skin issues, all of these kinds of cases, people would be cautioned to not eat these foods. These foods, and if any of you can solve this for me, like what the common denominator is here, I will be fascinated. The foods include chicken is the number one, fish from the ocean, but not from a lake. So lake fish, they would say was okay. Ocean fish, not okay. So I'm thinking heavy metals is a part of the picture here, or that something has to do with pollution. That was my first guess. Turtle, can't eat turtle if this is going on. And what else? Tofu, they would say no tofu. And alcohol, and maybe one or two other things that I'm not thinking of. We were always asking about sugar, and they were like, no, sugar's fine, like, unless you have diabetes. They were not concerned about sugar in the way that the current craze about being concerned about sugar is here. And it's not because they don't eat it, because in Shanghai, they are eating plenty of sugar. Wheat, they were not concerned about. Yeah, it was kind of hard for me to, get where all of that was coming from. And autoimmunity. So what I really saw with all of those thyroid cases is that they are always coming back to every single time, whenever we would try to ask a question to try to glean some of their clinical experience or like the patterns, they would always say, you just have to treat the patterns in that particular patient. So much of the art of Chinese medicine is about the pattern discrimination and the diagnosis, which is not the name of the disease the person has necessarily, but really about the complete unpacking and understanding of the case. And it was to the point where it was hard for us to even know how to ask questions because that would always be the answer. So that's, I guess, what I'll do to you is kind of say back, like, it's all about the patterns and the particular case that's in front of you. And Sharon says, anything you're going to drop or add to your practice? I know that's a big question. Oh, okay. Well, so I'm both glad and terrified that you asked. This experience made me really want to open a physical center to where I could work. And there are a lot of things that go into that. I am terrified, you guys, to even think about trying to have a physical place where this work lives. But I think, I've always wanted to work more collaboratively with other practitioners. And I'm so blessed to be able to work online and collaborate and share ideas in this medium. But there is something different about having a physical place where it's happening. And, a few weeks ago, I saw a question online where someone was like disparaging Chinese medicine and talking, rightly criticizing the use of parts of endangered animals and saying, oh, it's a superstition and all of this. And there are elements of it that are, but it's totally wrong to characterize the whole tradition that way. And he kind of said, like, show me one place or give me one book that will convince me that this is a valid practice. And I thought about that a lot. And the fact is that here, because we don't have kind of a traditional Chinese medicine hospital that's fully integrated with Western medicine, we don't have a lot of places that demonstrate how effective this tradition is when it's used responsibly and when it is, um, appropriately integrated with other kinds of treatments. So there's a part of me that's really like, all right, well, nobody else is doing it. Maybe I need to find a way to come together with some people and create a place like that. So that's kind of the new dream. And, you know, there are a lot of things I could say about the fears and the excitement that I have thinking about doing something like that. But that's the biggest change, is the real longing for a more embodied um, place of community and practice where we can start to demonstrate and encourage some cultural shifts. And I don't know, I think that would be a pretty worthy project, pretty exciting. Okay. Um, and yeah, okay. Um, in terms of, oh, and then there is sort of one other piece that I think is going to figure a lot more prominently in how I teach, even more than how I practice, because I think the practice, it really does. I mean, there are certain like pearls and formulas and things that I got that are going to be really useful, but in terms of broader concepts, I think more than I've ever understood before, I have seen how, in Western herbal medicine, there's a lot of focus on detoxification and on the ways that excess syndromes cause problems in the body. And it's really easy to see that in our population because of the nature of, our food system and, how things tend to show up for people. We don't see a ton of like malnourishment in this culture. We have different problems. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it's not what people in my position tend to treat because we're treating affluent people by and large. But in traditional Chinese medicine, they always will talk about the invasion of the excess factors, those external pathogenic factors that come in and like cause, the fire and the toxicity, the wind invasions, all of these things. The only way that stuff can get in and mess with you is if there is a deficiency or a lack of the zhang qi, the upright qi, and the the health and the vitality that somehow we have let slip or we have let collapse or has collapsed by no fault of our own. And so that's kind of, I think, going to become a much bigger piece of teaching in what I do moving forward, because I think that we really are missing that piece in terms of the way that the natural medicine world here looks. And I also think it's a really positive message that um, goes along with the psychological side of things that I think is so important about building ourselves up and nourishing ourselves, uplifting ourselves, rather than this sort of puritanical ethic of beating ourselves down. There's not, the Puritans did not set up shop in China at any point. So it's interesting, perhaps, to see all of those threads of sort of that puritanical influence in Western culture become a little more clear when you're in a culture where that's just never been part of the story, where the asceticism has been of a very different nature. So yeah. Okay. I think that's it, unless you guys have questions. So what I want to do, I'm just going to mention really briefly, if you have been thinking about doing any one-on-one work with me, before I went to China, I pretty much cleared my schedule and did not take on any new clients for quite a few weeks because I didn't want to just start working with somebody and then not be there. So I have lots of time right now, and I really do also have a need to bring some new clients into the practice and apply all of this great stuff that I've learned, and get the income flowing again after a period of time of being away and also kind of closing my doors to new people. So I've decided that in the spirit of opening the doors and welcoming some new faces. I'm going to offer, and I've never done this before, but I'm going to just offer across the board a 15% discount on all of my services for new clients. And that will be good until June 15th. So, hopefully it's not a huge difference, but hopefully it's just a little incentive that if you've been thinking about it, and it would serve you to help kind of put the timing in my favor so that I can bring in some new folks, and then also maybe encourage you to take the leap if you've been thinking about it but haven't been ready. So let me post a link here, and I'll send it out in email as well, for you to make an appointment if you would like. You can click um, on this link and book a time for us to talk, and we can just discuss, what your needs are, what the different offerings are that I have, and what would be a fit, for your needs and your budget. And if it's not really a good fit for the two of us to work together, I'm always happy to refer you or point you on to another resource. So I would absolutely love to chat with you, and if it's a good fit, I'd love to also give you that little bit of discount incentive. Oh, Sharon, I wish we lived near each other too. And Emily, oh my goodness, the retreats that I will have, and like all of us will be together in the flesh, and like it will be amazing, if and when this thing can get created. So that would be awesome. Um, and Sharon, whenever you're here, anytime, let me know, and I would love to get together and see what's going on. Um, okay. Yeah, that's my hope, is that I can start sharing stuff a little bit more and kind of get everything going and out into the world. All right, my dears, it was so good to connect with all of you and see you guys today, here in this space. And I will send an email with the recording, for anybody who kind of popped in and out. And just please, any feedback or ideas that you have, especially if you have thoughts or inspiration, or know anyone who's ever opened a wellness center who might be open to chatting with me and telling me their tips, I would love to hear it. And I just appreciate all of your support and presence, here and throughout everything that we're doing together online. So have a beautiful rest of your week. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sharon. It's my pleasure. I'm so happy that I got to go, and the least I can do is tell you guys about it. Okay. All right, everybody. Have a beautiful day. And let me know. Email me or set up a consult if you want to talk and see about working together. Okay, bye.